Welcome. Tonight, we journey to the sun-drenched deserts of ancient Persia, where brilliant minds found a way to harness wind, cool entire homes, and tame the heat with nothing more than clay, brick, and sky. This is the story of the Wind Tower, a quiet masterpiece of design and comfort, whispering across time from the rooftops of Yazd and beyond. Let's begin. The silent temples, how the Maya walked away from their great cities. Chapter 1. The Land of Scorching Sun. Long before electric fans or humming air conditioners, the cities of Persia bloomed in places most would have considered uninhabitable. A traveler approaching the old desert town of Yazd would first see a pale horizon bristling with slender towers, hundreds of them rising above flat roofs like chimneys. But these were not built to vent smoke. They were designed to catch the faintest breath of moving air and deliver it deep into the heart of each dwelling. Persia, known today as Iran, has always been a place of climatic extremes. In summer, the sun can scorch the land at temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. Dry winds sweep across the plateau, carrying dust that settles in every crevice. Rain falls rarely and unpredictably, and yet, for more than 1,000 years, people here have built not only settlements but entire cities, flourishing centers of commerce, scholarship, and art. Their secret was an ingenious marriage of architectural insight and environmental respect. Among all their inventions, none is more quietly elegant than the Badger, the Wind Tower. The word itself means wind catcher, and its purpose is as literal as it sounds. From the moment a house was conceived, its walls were oriented to align with prevailing winds. Builders measured the direction of seasonal breezes with the same care other civilizations reserve for laying out temples. Every tower was placed precisely so that it could harvest even the gentlest currents of moving air. The principle is disarmingly simple. Rising from the roof, the tower contains vertical shafts open to the outside at the top. When wind flows across the opening, it is funneled downward through the shaft and into the rooms below. Meanwhile, the tower's high walls, exposed to the searing sun, heat up more quickly than the air inside the dwelling. This differential creates a pressure gradient that draws warm air up and out, like smoke escaping a chimney. The combination of suction and fresh airflow transforms even the stillest desert afternoon into a gentle, cooling draft. Travelers wrote with wonder about the comfort of Persian houses. In the 13th century, an Arab geographer noted that in Yazd, the dwellings are cooled by tall towers which bring down the breeze. To a European used to heavy shutters and thick stone walls, the idea that wind alone could render a desert home tolerable seemed almost miraculous. But these towers were no luxury reserved for the wealthy. Walk any narrow lane of an old Persian city, and you will see wind catchers rising from modest courtyard houses, as well as grand merchant mansions. Some are small, with a single opening. Others are grand constructions with multiple shafts arranged like the petals of a flower, each facing a different compass point to capture wind, no matter which way it blew. What's most striking is how these towers became part of a larger environmental system. Builders combined them with subterranean canals called qanats, which carried cool water from distant mountain springs beneath the houses. In some designs, air descending the tower passed across a pool or wetted surfaces, losing additional heat by evaporation before flowing through the rooms. These methods anticipated modern evaporative coolers and passive ventilation by centuries. The effect was not merely practical. It was also psychological, a soft assurance that even in a hostile climate, human beings could create comfort without violence or excess. Persian architects did not seek to conquer the desert. They sought to cooperate with it, to channel its forces into something life-sustaining. If you stood on a rooftop at dawn, you might hear the first stirrings of the breeze and watch the long shadows retreat down narrow alleys. The towers would glow pale gold in the early light, their openings dark and expectant. As the sun climbed higher, the air in the lanes grew still and heavy. Yet inside, behind thick mud brick walls, a subtle current moved, fresh, faintly scented with earth, and impossibly cool. By night, the same towers helped purge the day's heat. The warm air stored in walls and floors rose into the shafts, escaping into the darkness. This daily rhythm of inhaling and exhaling, breathing in the wind and releasing the heat, made each dwelling an organism, alive in its quiet way. In the centuries to come, Persian engineers would refine their craft further, blending geometry, climate observation, and material science. But even in these earliest forms, the wind tower was a masterpiece, a technology that embodied knowledge passed from one generation to the next, adapting to each town's unique landscape. It is easy to imagine the builders standing beside a half-finished tower, gauging the air with outstretched hands, their faces turned to the sky. They worked not just with bricks and plaster, but with currents invisible to the eye. What they built was more than shelter. It was a declaration that human ingenuity could harmonize with nature rather than oppose it. As we begin this exploration of Persian wind towers, we will see how a simple idea evolved into a sophisticated art, how it shaped the skyline of cities and the daily rituals of their inhabitants. In the chapters ahead, we will trace how these elegant structures became symbols of resilience, grace, and quiet triumph over an unforgiving climate. Chapter 2: Foundations Beneath the Sand. When the first Persian engineers planned to build in the desert, they knew they had to think in more dimensions than simply height and breadth. They had to consider what lay unseen below the surface: soil that baked in a hardness under the relentless sun, water hidden in distant aquifers, shifting sands that could swallow walls if ignored. The wind tower, as graceful as it appeared above the rooftops, owed much of its success to a foundation designed as carefully as any palace. Before a single brick was laid, builders studied the land with an intimacy born of necessity. They dug test pits to understand the density of the soil. They pounded stakes into the ground, watching how quickly they were swallowed by drifting sands. They tasted earth between their fingers to judge its dryness. Generations of observation had taught them that the desert was alive, in motion even when it appeared still. This was no minor concern. A wind tower needed to be tall to function properly. A shaft that rose 10 or 15 meters above the roofline created the pressure difference essential to draw air downward. But that height brought weight and leverage, increasing the risk of collapse if the base shifted. To counteract this, Persian builders developed a layered foundation: courses of stone beneath courses of mud brick, alternating materials to distribute load evenly. In Yazd, surviving examples show how skillfully these builders anticipated the forces their structures would endure. Equally vital were the subterranean channels called qanats. These ancient waterworks, extending kilometers underground, brought meltwater from mountain springs to the settlements. A qanat was a marvel in its own right, a tunnel dug by hand, sloping gently enough to keep water flowing without flooding. Along its length, vertical shafts provided ventilation and access. For the wind towers, the qanats were a hidden ally. Some towers were built directly above an underground channel, so that air entering the home would be cooled further by passing over the moist conduit. Residents often dug basements or sunken courtyards adjacent to the main rooms. This was not only a way to gain cooler living spaces, but also part of the wind tower's design logic. Cool air from the tower naturally sank into these low chambers, displacing warmer air that rose to escape through vents. It was a passive cycle: no fans, no pumps, powered solely by the physics of pressure and temperature. Ancient builders understood these principles intuitively. In surviving manuscripts and oral traditions, they speak of teaching the house to breathe. To them, a wind tower was not a device separate from the building, but an extension of it, a lung that worked with the body of the house. That language, half poetic, reveals how integrated their thinking was. A home was an organism. It inhaled and exhaled, cooled itself, and balanced the energies of fire, water, earth, and air. This philosophy shaped every aspect of construction. When walls were raised, they were made thick, sometimes a meter across, so they could absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. Rooms were arranged around a central courtyard shaded by trees or lattice screens. The courtyards themselves were often paved with pale stone to reflect sunlight rather than absorb it. In this microclimate, the tower could do its work more effectively. Every choice of material, every angle of a wall or arch, supported the single goal of making the desert habitable. The process of construction was as much ritual as labor. Kilns fired day and night to produce bricks of uniform density. Lime was slaked and mixed with straw to create a plaster that resisted cracking. Artisans carved wooden grills to cover the tower's interior openings, breaking up drafts into softer currents. Neighbors and relatives would lend hands to lift heavy blocks into place. In this shared work, a house became more than property. It became a testament to collective ingenuity. Over weeks and months, the tower would rise course by course, its silhouette becoming familiar to everyone in the district. Children would watch from rooftops, fascinated as the builders hoisted bricks in baskets, laying them in circular tiers. Elderly women, accustomed to the rhythms of construction, offered advice or blessings. There was a sense that the tower did not belong solely to the family commissioning it, but to the whole community. Once complete, the final test came on the first truly hot day. As the sun climbed toward its zenith and the air shimmered above the alleys, the head mason would step inside. He would close the door behind him, wait in the gloom, and feel the movement of air against his skin. It was a moment of quiet triumph, proof that knowledge passed from one generation to the next could still tame the heat. If the breeze flowed as intended, cool and steady, the family would celebrate. Dates, flatbread, and tea would be set out. Guests would arrive to admire the new tower. Some would climb to the roof to look across the city, where hundreds of other wind catchers stood like sentinels against the sky. In time, each tower developed its own personality. Some produced strong, steady currents that whistled softly at night. Others gathered breezes so gentle they felt like a sigh. No two towers were identical because no two homes were built on identical ground. Each was the product of precise measurements. An intimate dialogue between climate, craftsmanship, and human need. This profound respect for the land set Persian builders apart. They did not pretend to ignore the desert's challenges. Instead, they embraced them, studying every gust of wind, every fold of the terrain. Their skill lay not in overpowering nature, but in understanding it so completely that it became an ally rather than an adversary. Even now, centuries later, if you stand in the shadow of one of these towers, you can feel the same breeze that once cooled generations of families. You can sense the continuity of purpose, a quiet assurance that no matter how harsh the world outside, there's always a way to shape shelter with patience and intelligence. In the next chapter, we will explore how these wind towers were adapted over time to serve larger public buildings, bazaars, and mosques, extending their benefits beyond private homes to entire communities. Chapter 3: Wind Towers Beyond the Home. While wind towers were first and foremost an answer to the intimate problem of domestic comfort, their influence soon extended beyond the quiet courtyards of private homes. As Persian cities grew and communities expanded, the need for cool, breathable public spaces became just as urgent as it was inside the family dwelling. And so the wind tower, that clever vertical lung, found new life in mosques, bazaars, schools, and caravanserais, transforming not only architecture but the rhythm of urban life itself. In the heart of every Persian city lay its pulse, the bazaar, covered, crowded, and alive with the mingling of voices and goods. It was the place where merchants bartered spices, fabrics, and precious metals, where families came to buy bread and herbs, where news traveled faster than the horses that brought it. But in the summer heat, the very structure of the bazaar, narrow corridors enclosed beneath arched ceilings, could become oppressive, a trap for hot air and human sweat. It was here that the wind tower showed its versatility. Rising above the domed roofs of the market, tall shafts were installed at key points, often at the intersections of corridors or above central courtyards. Their effect was immediate and almost magical. As air flowed down through the towers and moved through shaded arcades, it created a subtle current that kept shoppers and merchants alike from succumbing to the desert's heat. The markets became livable even at midday. Trade continued, and the city breathed. Some of these towers were combined with water channels beneath the walkways. Known as sabats, these covered alleyways often concealed cannon-fed pools or cisterns. The air drawn through the wind tower would pass over this cool water before flowing into the bazaar, creating an early form of evaporative cooling. In larger cities like Isfahan, this system became so refined that the air within the bazaar remained significantly cooler than the streets outside, even on the hottest days. Elsewhere, the wind tower served sacred architecture. The great mosques of Persia, built not only for prayer but also for study, reflection, and gathering, needed to provide sanctuary from the punishing climate. Builders incorporated wind towers into prayer halls and surrounding chambers. These towers were often grander, more ornamented, their forms carefully integrated into the overall symmetry of the mosque design. As worshippers stood shoulder to shoulder in rows, the gentle breeze, descending from above, provided relief, allowing concentration and calm. In a sense, the architecture itself became part of the spiritual experience, humbling in its harmony with nature. In madrasas or schools of Islamic learning, the wind tower supported both the body and the mind. Teachers and students often studied in shaded colonnades or open-air halls surrounding a central pool. With a tower positioned nearby, the cooling air encouraged long hours of reading and quiet contemplation. Knowledge could take root more easily in comfort than in sweat. Here again, we see how Persian engineers viewed comfort not as luxury, but as necessity, for clarity of thought, for civility, for the dignity of life. One of the most remarkable public uses of the wind tower was in the caravanserai. These roadside inns, scattered across the vast trade routes of Persia, offered shelter to travelers and merchants moving between cities. Often located in harsh, remote landscapes, caravanserais needed to provide rest not only for humans but also for animals. Without modern conveniences, a cool room after a long desert journey was a small miracle. Engineers outfitted many of these structures with towers to direct wind into common sleeping quarters, kitchens, and stables. Some caravanserais featured multiple towers, each oriented to a different direction to ensure one would always catch the prevailing breeze. For travelers arriving under a baking sun, the sensation of stepping into a shaded hall cooled by fresh air must have felt like entering another world. These communal applications of wind tower technology reflect a broader Persian ethos, that architecture should serve society, not merely the individual. The same values that shaped the private home, attentiveness to climate, intelligent use of materials, humility before nature, were applied to structures that defined civic life. Comfort was not hoarded behind high walls. It was shared across markets, mosques, and public gathering places. This principle extended even to urban planning. City layouts were designed to support airflow. Streets were oriented to maximize the movement of wind through narrow lanes. Open spaces like squares and gardens were strategically placed to allow breezes to circulate freely. Wind towers dotted the skyline like punctuation marks in a well-composed sentence, each one helping the city breathe more easily. In Yazd, where some of the finest examples still survive, an aerial view reveals a forest of towers interspersed among mud brick homes and minarets. To modern eyes, the uniform beige tones of the architecture may seem monotonous, but to someone raised in this environment, every tower has a personality. Some are square, others octagonal. Some stand tall and proud, others squat and unassuming. Together, they form a collective memory of ingenuity. By adapting the wind tower to public spaces, Persian engineers did more than cool rooms. They fostered a culture of care. They recognized that the well-being of the community depended not only on laws or religion, but also on the physical environment. In designing for breathability, They affirmed that every person deserved comfort, whether a merchant selling figs, a child reciting poetry, or a traveler seeking shelter under foreign stars. Today, as cities around the world confront rising temperatures and the cost of artificial cooling, the Persian wind tower has re-emerged in architectural discourse, not as a quaint relic, but as a model of sustainable design. Its legacy invites us to ask, what does it mean to build with respect? How might we listen again to the wind? In the next chapter, we will journey into the heart of seasonal adaptation, discovering how Persian engineers use towers differently in winter and summer, ensuring comfort year-round using nothing but the logic of physics and the poetry of craft. Chapter 4. Seasons in the Tower. Though much of the world pictures Persia as a land of relentless summer, the reality has always been more complex. The high plateaus and desert valleys experience extremes of heat and cold, searing afternoons followed by surprisingly chill nights, baking summers balanced by winters that could bring frost. For Persian builders, designing a wind tower was never a matter of creating a single effect. It was about orchestrating a balance across the seasons, coaxing comfort out of the shifting air. From the very first towers, engineers understood that a system built only for summer would fail half the year. The challenge was deceptively simple. How could one structure deliver cooling breezes in July and preserve warmth in January? To solve this, architects developed a set of principles that read like an intuitive science, a choreography of air and temperature, light and shadow. During the summer months, when the desert heat radiated off every wall and courtyard, the wind tower performed its most obvious function, catching the faintest breeze and funneling it down into the living spaces. In cities like Yazd or Kashan, builders oriented tower openings toward the prevailing northerly winds, which arrived cooler than currents from the south. Even the interior walls of the tower were lined with smooth plaster to reduce friction and help the air descend more quickly. At times, families hung wet textiles inside the shaft so that air would pick up moisture and cool further as it flowed into rooms. But when winter came, the same openings could become pathways for unwanted drafts. Persian ingenuity revealed itself here in the simplest solutions. Wooden shutters were fitted at the tops of the shafts, ready to be closed when the temperature dropped. In some regions, these closures were operated by ropes running down the tower wall to a room below, so that a resident could open or seal the tower without climbing to the roof. Once the openings were blocked, the tower's vertical chimney effect reversed its purpose. Instead of drawing in cold air, it allowed stale, warm air and smoke from fireplaces to escape slowly, preventing suffocation while preserving warmth. It was an elegant compromise, ventilation without sacrificing heat. In this way, the tower became a living instrument, tuned to the season's demands. Builders also considered how walls and floors stored and released energy. The thick mud brick that formed most houses' skeletons served as a kind of thermal battery. Under the high summer sun, the walls absorbed heat, then surrendered it only after nightfall when the outside air cooled. Residents used this rhythm to their advantage, opening windows and tower vents in the evening to flush out heat and trap cooler night air. In winter, the process reversed. Windows and vents were closed during the day to preserve warmth absorbed by walls in the weak sunlight, then reopened sparingly to allow fresh air. The courtyard, too, played a seasonal role. In hot months, it was shaded with awnings or planted with tall trees whose leaves cooled the air by evaporation. In winter, many families removed the coverings to let the low-angled sun warm the paving stones. Even the surface material mattered. Pale tiles reflected the summer glare, while darker stones soaked up whatever heat they could in the colder months. In some wealthier homes and public buildings, a variation of the wind tower appeared, the two-story badger. In these constructions, the lower level of the tower could be closed entirely in winter, while a smaller upper chamber with narrow vents allowed controlled ventilation. The builders thought carefully about cross-sections, internal partitions, and the angle of openings. A tower was not simply an empty tube. It was a sequence of spaces, each calibrated to the year's changing needs. This seasonal adaptability extended to social customs. During cold nights, families gathered in the central room, often called the Hosgana, which was smaller, easier to heat, and located adjacent to the courtyard. The wind tower might be partially closed, allowing just enough circulation to clear smoke from lamps or braziers. In summer, the same room transformed into a cool retreat, benefiting from the breeze drawn through the tower's open shaft. Merchants learned to adapt their shops in similar ways. In the bazaar, a tower that brought welcome relief in the midday sun could be shuttered as evening descended and temperatures plummeted. Caravanserais prepared for both extremes, with storage rooms designed to hold perishable goods that needed a consistent coolness and dormitories equipped with thick curtains to trap warmth. The elegance of this seasonal design is best appreciated when you remember that it relied on no mechanical energy, no pumps, no electricity, no motors. It was a perfect embodiment of passive architecture. Builders drew on the same knowledge of thermodynamics that underlies modern HVAC systems, though they spoke of it in different terms: balance, breath, and the interplay of hot and cold. Their success shows in the survival of so many towers. Some of the Badgers and Yazd have stood for more than 5 centuries, with minimal changes in form or function. Even today, you can stand beneath a tall shaft in midsummer and feel a current of air that seems impossible in the desert heat. If you walk the old neighborhoods at dawn, you might see a householder climbing a ladder to adjust the shutters or listening carefully to the whisper inside the shaft. These small rituals, repeated season after season, embody an attitude that modern architecture sometimes forgets: that a building should respond to the world around it, rather than imposing a single, fixed climate. In modern times, as cities grapple with energy shortages and climate challenges, architects have returned to study these Persian principles. The seasonal adaptability of wind towers offers a roadmap to design that is at once sustainable, efficient, and profoundly humane. In the chapters ahead, we will trace how wind tower design became a symbol of cultural identity and pride, how it evolved across centuries, and how it continues to inspire architects searching for answers to the timeless question of how to make shelter both resilient and beautiful. Chapter 5: Towers of Identity and Pride. That as centuries passed, wind towers evolved from purely functional structures into emblems of cultural ingenuity and pride. They became part of the Persian skyline, each one declaring the presence of a community that refused to yield to the desert's austerity. Whether in bustling trade cities or quiet villages, the towers embodied an idea larger than comfort alone. They were a statement of belonging, a symbol of civilization flourishing in an unlikely place. By the late medieval period, wind towers were no longer limited to practical buildings. Nobles and affluent merchants began to commission towers that were as much works of art as devices of ventilation. Brickwork grew more elaborate, with decorative bands encircling the shaft, carved inscriptions along the cornice, and glazed tiles shimmering in the sun. In Yazd, where dozens of towers rose above the rooftops, they came to define the silhouette of the city, each one distinct in detail, yet collectively forming a visual identity as recognizable as any skyline of minarets. These towers were not merely ornaments. The choice to embellish them spoke to a deeper cultural impulse. In Persian philosophy, beauty and utility were not opposites, but allies. A structure was most admirable when it satisfied both the needs of the body and the aspirations of the spirit. To look upon a finely built wind tower was to feel, even in the harshest climate, that human endeavor could tame and even celebrate nature. Travelers passing through the region often remarked on the tower's grace. Early European explorers in the 17th and 18th centuries described them in journals as high chimneys or lofty ventilators, puzzled by their purpose. One Italian merchant wrote that they resemble the turrets of castles, yet no guard watches within. Local guides would smile at the misunderstandings and gently explain. These were not symbols of war, but of life, raised to gather invisible gifts from the sky. Within Persian society, the towers became a point of local pride. Families who built them were seen as forward-thinking, investing in the well-being of their household and contributing to the beauty of the neighborhood. Skilled builders earned reputations that stretched across provinces. A master craftsman whose towers combined effective cooling with elegant design would be in high demand, traveling from Yaz to Kerman to supervise new commissions. Some communities developed distinctive regional styles. In Kerman, wind towers tended to be taller and slimmer, suited to the more variable winds. In Kashan, they were often octagonal, their facades decorated with niches to create shifting shadows. In coastal Hormuz, where humidity posed an additional challenge, builders experimented with broader openings and internal baffles to keep damp air from settling in the rooms below. This diversity of forms was matched by a diversity of names. Though badger was most common, other terms emerged: malcaf in Arabic-speaking regions, windcatcher in English accounts. Each name reflected a slightly different emphasis: catching, guiding, harnessing, but all expressed the same fundamental idea: that the wind, which elsewhere brought dust and discomfort, could here be transformed into an ally. It is telling that wind towers were often featured in local poetry and folklore. Ballads sung by traveling minstrels spoke of towers as symbols of resilience, silent sentinels that guarded households through the longest summers. Children grew up with stories that imbued the towers with personality, as if each had its own moods and preferences, a temperament shaped by centuries of desert winds. This storytelling tradition was more than whimsy. It anchored the towers within a cultural landscape that valued adaptation over conquest. Unlike fortresses or city walls, which proclaimed dominion over the land, wind towers expressed partnership with it. They whispered a philosophy that true strength lay not in resisting nature, but in learning from it. Perhaps this is why, even as modern technologies arrived, mechanical fans, electric air conditioning, the wind towers retained their hold on the imagination. Some families installed motors within old shafts, blending tradition and innovation. Others left the towers intact, using them in the milder seasons and reserving modern systems only for the hottest days. In both cases, the silhouette remained, a familiar form on the horizon, linking generations. Preservation efforts in the 20th and 21st centuries recognized that to lose the wind towers would be to lose a repository of collective memory. Restoration projects began in earnest, supported by architects who studied the towers not only as heritage but as blueprints for sustainable living. Schools incorporated lessons about their design into curricula, ensuring that each new generation understood the principles that shaped their cities. Today, visitors to Yazd or Nain can stand in narrow lanes and look up to see a forest of towers rising from rooftops. Some are centuries old, their bricks worn smooth by sun and sand. Others are newly built, part of a revival that blends ancient knowledge with modern needs. In their quiet dignity, they remind us that architecture can be both a shelter and a story, a place to live and a way to remember who we are. In the next chapter, we will follow the lives of the artisans who dedicated themselves to mastering the art of wind tower construction, exploring the skills passed from teacher to apprentice and the quiet pride of those who shaped air into comfort. Chapter 6: The Master Builders. Behind every wind tower that rose above the Persian skyline stood a community of artisans whose knowledge and skills were shaped by generations of observation, trial, and refinement. These were the ustads, the master builders, and their apprentices, men whose hands and minds brought the towers from lines sketched in the dust to structures that transformed how people lived. Unlike court architects who designed palaces or monumental mosques, wind tower craftsmen were often more modest in social status. They were builders, masons, and carpenters, sometimes descended from long lines of artisans who passed their craft down like a treasured inheritance. Yet within their circles, expertise in wind towers commanded quiet respect. It was said that any mason could raise a wall, but only a few could guide the wind. The education of an apprentice began with material familiarity. The young builders learned how to shape and lay mud brick, an unassuming material that required special care. The bricks needed the right blend of clay, straw, and water, molded in wooden frames and left to dry in the fierce sun. If they cracked or warped, the tower's stability would be compromised. Apprentices spent long hours inspecting bricks, tapping them to hear their sound, and studying their surface for imperfections. Next came lessons in proportion and orientation. A wind tower that was too narrow would not generate sufficient airflow, too wide, and it would lose pressure. The ustads taught their students to measure carefully, adjusting the shaft's width and height to suit the building's size and the prevailing winds of the region. They consulted hand-drawn plans, but more often relied on memory and experience, knowledge inscribed in callous palms rather than parchment. One of the most delicate aspects was the crafting of the internal vanes and partitions. These wooden or brick dividers directed airflow within the shaft, allowing the builder to fine-tune the currents. A slight adjustment in angle, just a few degrees, could determine whether a room was pleasantly cool or stifling. Apprentices watched in silence as masters set the partitions, their gestures practiced and precise. In Yazd, families commissioned the same teams of builders generation after generation, trusting them to adapt designs to each home's needs. When an ustad arrived to plan a tower, he did so with an understanding of more than physics. He took into account the family's habits, the arrangement of their rooms, and even their privacy concerns. A tower might be placed away from the women's quarters or oriented to avoid carrying voices between neighboring courtyards. Construction was usually a communal effort. Neighbors helped haul bricks, mix mortar, and raise scaffolding. As the tower grew taller, wooden ladders were lashed together, and workers balanced with confidence high above the alleys. Children watched from rooftops, craning their necks to glimpse the new landmark taking shape. Throughout the process, the ustad served not only as builder, but as teacher. He narrated each step to the apprentices, explaining why certain adjustments mattered and reminding them that no two towers were alike. The lessons were always rooted in respect for the environment. No wind tower was constructed in ignorance of local conditions. Each was an answer to a specific climate, a precise marriage of form and function. When the final bricks were laid, a small ceremony often marked the tower's completion. The builder would climb to the top and, with a sweep of his hand, invite the first currents of air into the shaft. Some believe this gesture had a touch of blessing, a way of asking the wind to be gentle and generous in the years ahead. The finished tower was not left alone to do its work. Over the seasons, builders returned to inspect and maintain it. In the fierce heat, plaster cracked and needed repair. Wooden louvers warped and required replacement. The master builders considered this care as much a part of their craft as construction itself. A neglected tower was not simply an architectural failure, but a sign of forgetfulness toward the family it served. In larger towns, ustads organized guilds, sharing techniques and agreeing on standards for materials and wages. Though rivalries existed, there was also a sense of solidarity, an unspoken recognition that they all contributed to the health and dignity of the community. When travelers praised the city's cool interiors, it was these builders' legacy they were admiring, even if their names never appeared in official chronicles. Beyond their technical expertise, the master builders nurtured a philosophy that blended practicality with poetry. They spoke of the wind not only as an element to be managed, but as a kind of invisible companion, a force that could be coaxed but never conquered outright. Their towers were invitations to this companion, gestures of welcome carved from mud and timber. As centuries passed and mechanical cooling began to supplant traditional methods, the craft of wind tower building waned. Yet some families continued to pass down the skills, determined not to let their heritage be forgotten. In recent decades, renewed interest in sustainable architecture has brought their work back into the spotlight. Architects and historians have sought out the last surviving ustads to record their knowledge before it faded. Today, when visitors walk the narrow lanes of Yazd or Kashan, they see not just a cityscape of towers, but the accumulated labor and wisdom of countless unnamed hands. Each tower stands as a quiet testament to the ingenuity of artisans who learned to shape the air itself, and to the patient art of teaching generation after generation. In the next chapter, we will explore how these towers adapted to different regions and climates, evolving new forms in coastal cities, highland villages, and beyond. Chapter 7. Adapting to every landscape. While the classic image of a wind tower conjures visions of desert cities like Yazd, the genius of these structures lay in their adaptability across regions with strikingly different climates. From the salt-laden air of the Persian Gulf to the cooler plateaus of central Iran, builders modified their designs to meet each place's unique challenges. The wind tower was never a single formula applied everywhere, but rather a repertoire of solutions refined to harmonize with the land. In the coastal cities, particularly along the shores of the Gulf, humidity presented an obstacle unknown to the high deserts. Here, winds arrived laden with moisture, threatening to bring dampness and mold into the buildings they cooled. Builders in places like Bandar Abbas experimented with broader openings near the top of the shaft. Instead of narrow slits designed to maximize velocity, these towers featured wide, shallow vents to disperse air more gently. Inside, wooden lattices and baffles were placed to slow the movement and allow the moist air to lose some of its heaviness before drifting into living spaces. In especially humid months, families in these coastal towns developed clever techniques to regulate their towers. They would partially shutter the upper vents to limit the flow, then hang strips of woven reed across the openings to act as simple filters. At night, when the air grew cooler and drier, the reed screens were removed and the tower resumed its work at full capacity. Moving inland, to the highland villages perched among rocky plateaus, the problems were reversed. Here, the air was dry but frequently cold, especially at night. Builders adapted by constructing towers with dual chambers, a larger main shaft to catch the summer winds and a smaller, auxiliary passage for winter ventilation. These auxiliary chambers could be sealed almost entirely when temperatures dropped, preserving the warmth stored in thick stone walls. One remarkable example survives in a caravanserai along the ancient Silk Road route. This building's wind tower rose in two distinct tiers, each with separate controls. Merchants arriving in summer marveled at how cool air poured into the sleeping quarters, even as the daytime sun scorched the stones outside. In winter, the caretaker closed the upper tier completely, allowing only a thin trickle of fresh air through the lower vents to prevent stagnation. Travelers spoke of it as a marvel, a tower that listens to the seasons. In oasis settlements, where the contrast between scorching day and cool night was most pronounced, builders used a combination of wind towers and underground water channels called canets. A canet carried water from distant aquifers through gently sloping tunnels, emerging in the courtyards of homes. When paired with a wind tower, this water became a powerful ally in cooling. Air descending through the tower would pass over the moist surface of a small pool or channel, picking up evaporation and lowering its temperature further. In this way, the tower and the canet formed a synergy, a graceful coordination of earth and air. Some towers in oasis towns even incorporated small vents at the base, which could be opened to draw air upward, an inversion of the normal flow. On windless days, this created a convection current. Warm air rose through the shaft, and cooler air was pulled up from shaded water below. Residents described this as the tower breathing, a living rhythm that shifted with the hour and season. Beyond their technical adaptations, these regional variations shaped the tower's visual character. In coastal cities, towers were often plastered in brilliant white to reflect the sun, while highland towers wore the warm ochre of the local clay. Decorative features changed, too. Builders in the humid south favored simple latticework and flat-top parapets to withstand strong winds, whereas in the plateau cities, taller crowns and ornate cornices were common, their silhouette a proud signature against the sky. These local expressions created a quiet sense of identity. Even from a distance, A traveler could tell where he was by the shape of the towers rising above the rooftops. A squat, broad-top tower signaled the Gulf Coast. A tall, slender tower with multiple vents belonged to Yazd or Kerman. In each region, builders honored shared principles: passive cooling, balance with nature, while responding to their specific environment. The adaptability of wind towers is one of their most enduring lessons. In a world where architecture often seeks a single, universal solution, these structures remind us that true sustainability grows out of respect for place. The Persian builders did not impose a rigid ideal on every settlement. Instead, they listened to the land, to the wind, to the habits of the people who would live within the walls. They shaped their towers to suit the rhythms of each landscape. Today, as modern architects grapple with the challenges of climate change, many look back to these examples for guidance. The regional variations of Persian wind towers stand as a testament to the idea that building well means building with empathy for the earth, for the climate, and for the daily life of a community. In the next chapter, we will explore how the wind towers became woven into the fabric of social life, influencing everything from household rituals to city-wide celebrations. Chapter 8. Living with the Wind. In Persian towns and villages where wind towers rose from almost every rooftop, life unfolded beneath their quiet influence. They were not merely architectural features, but companions to the rhythms of daily existence. The slow breathing of air through each shaft shaped habits, social customs, and even the way families gathered in their homes. Each dawn, when the desert's chill still lingered, the towers stood silent. Windows remained closed to keep the coolness in, and the women of the household moved about quietly, preparing breakfast while the city woke. As the sun climbed higher and the first currents of heated air began to stir, the wind towers came alive. One by one, shutters were eased open. A gentle draft slipped through the interior spaces, and the sounds of morning, water drawn from cisterns, merchants calling in the streets, were carried indoors on its back. In many homes, the tower's cooling presence defined the layout of living areas. Rooms nearest the tower shaft were reserved for summer use. Shaded spaces with woven reed mats on the floors and low cushions set in semicircles to catch the breeze. Here, families retreated during the hottest hours, sharing midday meals in the coolest corners. A courtyard fountain might gurgle nearby, its evaporating spray adding an extra touch of relief to the air flowing past. Children quickly learned which rooms were favored by the wind. On afternoons when temperatures soared, they invented quiet games in the shaded chambers, spreading pebbles or dried chickpeas across the mats in elaborate patterns. The tower's gentle size became a backdrop to these small rituals, a reassurance that even when the world outside shimmered with heat, life indoors could remain soft and bearable. Over time, each household developed its own patterns of tending the tower. Before the hottest weeks began, men climbed the narrow ladders to inspect the openings and check for cracks in the plaster. Screens were cleaned of dust and cobwebs. In some families, these preparations took on a ceremonial quality, marking the transition from spring to the long season of heat. Stories were told as the work progressed, tales of ancestors who had built the tower or of travelers who once praised its design. Beyond individual homes, wind towers influenced how neighbors interacted. The rooftops of older quarters were connected by low walls or parapets, and residents moved easily from one to another. In the evenings, when temperatures dropped and air cooled, families gathered atop their houses to share gossip and tea. From these rooftops, the towers loomed in every direction, their dark openings catching the last traces of twilight. Sometimes, a child would ask why the towers all faced slightly different ways. The answer was always the same: they follow the wind. In cities like Yazd, the presence of so many towers created a communal soundscape. When the wind blew strong, the shafts produced a low, hollow murmur, like dozens of distant flutes playing a single note. Residents spoke of this as a kind of music, the voice of the town itself. On windless days, the silence felt heavier, a reminder of how essential the breeze was to comfort and well-being. The towers also shaped the rhythms of trade and craft. In workshops, cloth dyers and metalworkers chose workspaces that benefited from ventilation, knowing that the moving air helped regulate both temperature and the dispersal of fumes. Bazaars were laid out to catch crosswinds wherever possible. Even in the design of caravanserais, builders included small towers to keep travelers comfortable during their stay. The idea was so integral that to build without considering airflow was seen as a mark of poor judgment. Seasonal festivals, too, found ways to acknowledge the towers. During the Mergen Festival, a celebration of autumn and harvest, some families decorated the tops of their wind towers with colored banners or garlands of dried flowers. As the air moved through the shafts, the decorations fluttered, signaling both gratitude for the cooling winds of summer and welcome for the milder days to come. What is striking, looking back, is how seamlessly the towers blended into every facet of life. They were both background and center, always present, seldom remarked upon, yet vital. A child growing up beneath their shadows might never think to question their existence. Only upon traveling elsewhere, where no breeze slipped down into the rooms, did the significance become clear. In this quiet integration lay the towers' enduring power. They were not simply a response to a technical challenge, but an example of architecture embedded in culture. No one needed to be taught to appreciate them. The appreciation arose naturally as comfort and community intertwined. Today, those who visit the old quarters of Yazd or Kashan can glimpse this world still flickering to life. Though modern air conditioners hum behind new walls, many families maintain their towers, opening them on mild days and remembering the customs that once defined each season. In their graceful forms, the memory of a way of living remains intact, an unbroken link between past and present. In the next chapter, we will look at how knowledge of wind tower construction spread beyond Persia's borders, inspiring adaptations in other cultures and climates. Chapter 9. Across Borders and Empires. The genius of the Persian wind tower did not remain confined to the highlands and deserts of Iran. Over time, knowledge of this passive cooling technology migrated across regions, reshaped and reinterpreted by different cultures as it followed the trade routes, conquests, and exchanges of the medieval and early modern world. In an age before globalization, architecture spread not only through blueprints or treaties, but through the footsteps of travelers, merchants, and craftsmen who carried with them stories of homes cooled by wind alone. One of the most direct paths of influence ran along the Persian Gulf, where the bustling ports of southern Iran traded regularly with cities on the Arabian Peninsula. From Bandar Abbas to Muscat, stories spread of towers that could tame the desert heat. Builders in Oman, Bahrain, and parts of the United Arab Emirates began experimenting with their own versions. In places like Dubai's old Al Fahidi district, Barjeel Square stone wind towers rose atop coral stone houses, providing both ventilation and prestige. While often shorter and more rigid in form than their Persian cousins, these towers shared the same logic: draw in wind from above, channel it downward, and make desert living bearable. In Egypt, particularly in Cairo during the Mamluk and later Ottoman periods, builders developed the Malkaf, a roof-level wind catcher shaped more like a scoop than a tower. Unlike the tall shafts of Yazd, Malkafs jutted outward like beaks, angled to face the prevailing winds from the Nile Valley. They were typically paired with mashrabiyah, ornate wooden screens that shaded interiors while allowing airflow. The Egyptians prized privacy and modesty, and their architectural forms reflected these values. Yet the underlying principles of passive cooling mirrored those perfected centuries earlier in Persia. Further west, along the Maghreb coast, Islamic architects adopted similar strategies for managing heat, though in more subtle forms. Courtyards with fountains, thick walls, and narrow alleys created natural ventilation. Wind towers themselves were rarer, yet travelers' accounts suggest that knowledge of them was not unknown. Some suggest that even in Andalusia, Spain, under Muslim rule, certain cooling systems may have been inspired by Persian techniques, though adapted to Mediterranean conditions. To the east, in the Mughal Empire of India, the transfer of architectural ideas occurred more selectively. Though the Mughals favored grand domes, wide courtyards, and water channels, Persian engineers and architects were regularly employed in courtly projects. Certain regional palaces, particularly in hot and arid Rajasthan, reveal ventilation shafts and rooftop vents that suggest an echo of the wind tower's logic, modified, perhaps, for aesthetics and scale. The mechanism of knowledge transfer was as fascinating as the structures themselves. Persian builders, often multilingual and respected for their skills, were hired by foreign patrons to design palaces, mosques, and residences. Some traveled by invitation, others journeyed on pilgrimage routes, finding work along the way. When they built, they taught. Apprentices in new lands absorbed the principles, even if they adapted the style. These slow, quiet exchanges stitched together a web of architectural intelligence that spanned continents. But it wasn't only builders who spread the idea. Travelers and scholars wrote detailed descriptions in journals and letters. The famed Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta, for instance, described Persian houses as remarkably cool despite the oppressive heat, attributing the comfort to towers through which the air descends. His writings circulated widely, sparking curiosity among scholars in North Africa and beyond. European traders and emissaries, especially during the Safavid era, also took note. They were astonished to enter homes that offered refuge from the sun, without relying on fans or ice. Jesuit missionaries in particular were known to study local technologies with fascination. Though few wind towers were ever constructed in Europe, the principles of passive cooling entered architectural discourse and influenced later developments in sustainable building design. Interestingly, the idea of using natural airflow to cool buildings found parallel development in other cultures entirely removed from Persia's influence. In parts of China, for example, open-air courtyards and ventilation shafts served similar purposes. In Mesoamerica, certain temples were aligned to catch prevailing breezes, offering relief in hot months. Yet few systems matched the wind tower's elegance and efficiency, especially in truly arid climates. As modern technologies began to dominate the built environment, especially with the advent of electricity and air conditioning, the spread of wind tower knowledge slowed. In many places, towers were abandoned, replaced by ceiling fans, then by humming compressors and metal ducts. Yet traces remained. In old city quarters from Bahrain to Baghdad, remnants of towers still rise, weathered but proud. Their silhouettes remain embedded in the memory of place, like echoes of a time when architecture was in dialogue with the wind itself. In recent decades, a renewed global interest in sustainable design has brought wind towers back into focus. Architects and environmentalists alike are studying ancient forms with fresh eyes, recognizing that what was once seen as primitive is, in fact, profoundly advanced. Today's designers see the wind tower not only as a cooling mechanism, but as a philosophy, one that honors climate, resourcefulness, and quiet cooperation with nature. In the next chapter, we will explore the science behind the towers themselves, diving into the physics of air movement and thermal behavior that allowed these elegant structures to cool entire buildings without a single moving part. Chapter 10. The Physics of Cooling. Beneath the graceful arches and handsome plasterwork of a Persian wind tower lies a story of pure physics. Though its outward form varies by region and style, its function relies on universal principles: pressure, temperature differentials, and the constant dance between air and heat. For centuries, the builders who refined these structures did not need formal equations to understand them. Observation and intuition, repeated over generations, proved to be as precise as any formula. At the heart of the tower's operation lies a simple truth: air in motion becomes a tool. When a breeze passes over the opening of the tower, it creates a pressure differential. The windward side receives higher pressure, pushing air into the shaft. The leeward openings, facing away from the prevailing wind, experience lower pressure, drawing air out. This dynamic flow pulls fresh air down into the house below and extracts warmer air upward through opposite vents. Even a mild breeze can create a significant movement, replacing the entire volume of indoor air several times an hour. Builders refined this process with an artful sense of proportion. They understood that the height of the tower affects the velocity of descending air. A taller shaft allows more pressure to build at the top, increasing the pull of cooler air. But they also learned that too narrow a channel could choke the airflow. Over time, regional styles settled on proportions that balanced force with gentleness. A current strong enough to refresh without stirring dust or extinguishing oil lamps. In climates where breezes were unreliable, the towers depended on another phenomenon: convective currents. Warm air, being less dense, rises naturally. Even on windless days, the sun's heat striking the walls of the tower causes the air inside to warm and ascend. As it escapes through the upper vents, cooler air from lower in the building or from shaded courtyards is drawn up to replace it. This cycle continues day and night, moderated only by the sun's path and the mass of the building itself. To enhance this effect, builders frequently combined towers with canets, the underground channels that delivered water across great distances. When air entered a tower and passed over a cannet-fed reservoir or a shallow pool in the basement, it was cooled further by evaporation. The principle here is deceptively simple. As water evaporates, it absorbs heat from the surrounding air. Moisture-laden currents would rise through the tower, cooling every chamber as they moved. In desert towns where temperatures exceeded 40 degrees Celsius by midday, this process made the difference between suffocating heat and tolerable comfort. Another subtle trick was the use of thermal mass. The thick mud brick or stone walls of Persian homes absorbed heat during the day and slowly released it overnight. This meant that even if the tower drew in warm afternoon air, it encountered cooled surfaces that moderated its temperature before it reached living spaces. Builders calculated the thickness of walls and the placement of windows with astonishing precision, using centuries of collective experience to create interiors that stayed within a narrow band of temperatures all year. These scientific principles were not hidden knowledge. They were understood, demonstrated, and taught in workshops where master builders passed their skills to apprentices. Over time, the lessons crystallized into rules. Face the main vent toward the prevailing summer wind. Maintain a shaft tall enough to create pressure. Include an outlet to draw warm air upward. And if possible, link the system to underground water. Centuries before words like sustainability and passive cooling entered modern language, Persian builders had mastered both. They achieved what many contemporary architects still strive to recreate: an environment shaped to human comfort without the need for machines. While their knowledge grew from necessity, it was also guided by a philosophy, a belief that the best solutions are those that harmonize with the forces already present in the world. Even so, the physics alone does not fully explain the wind tower's power. Its success depends on the way these physical principles were married to cultural patterns. Builders didn't simply create a cooling device. They designed homes that fit around the tower, with courtyards, domed ceilings, and shaded passages all contributing to the effect. The tower was never an isolated object. It was part of a total vision, an understanding that architecture should be a living system, not a collection of disconnected parts. In modern times, as designers return to these ancient principles, they find that the old knowledge still holds. Computer models confirm what the builders knew intuitively: that air can be guided and tempered, that heat can be balanced rather than fought, and that the simplest materials, mud brick, water, and open space, can outperform the most advanced machines if arranged with care. In the next chapter, we will turn our attention from the physics to the aesthetics of wind towers, exploring how beauty and function were woven together so that even the most practical structure could inspire a sense of wonder. Chapter 11. The Aesthetics of Air. If the wind tower had been only a functional necessity, it would still have earned respect for its ingenuity. But what set these structures apart was their grace, the way they transformed the utilitarian act of cooling into something worthy of admiration. In Persian cities, wind towers rose like silent sentinels, each shaped with an artist's sense of form. Beauty and purpose met at every angle, creating a skyline that reflected both human need and aspiration. From a distance, the towers were unmistakable. They pierced the low, earth-colored roofs like slender watchtowers or abstracted trees. Their facades, often ornamented with arched niches or delicate plaster latticework, cast patterned shadows on the rooftops at dawn and dusk. Even the most modest towers bore some decorative flourish. A carved inscription, a tile mosaic, a parapet outlined in geometric relief. Though their purpose was practical, their makers believed that utility did not preclude elegance. Part of this aesthetic appeal lay in proportion. Builders understood instinctively that a tower's height must be balanced by the solidity of its base. Too tall, and it appeared precarious. Too squat, and it lost its sense of aspiration. Over centuries, regional styles evolved distinct profiles. The slender, tapering towers of Yazd, the more robust square forms of Kerman, the barrel-vaulted openings in Bahrain. Each variation reflected both climate and culture, yet all shared a common language of dignified simplicity. At street level, the towers contributed to a city's identity. Travelers arriving in Yazd often remarked first upon the forest of wind catchers, their openings angled in different directions. Some compared them to sails or masts, as if the town itself were a ship anchored in the desert. In the glow of evening, when lamplight glimmered inside their shafts, the towers seemed almost alive, breathing, watching, waiting for the next day's heat to rise. Yet the beauty of the towers did not reside solely in their silhouette. Inside, their cool channels became a backdrop for everyday rituals. Families sat in shaded rooms where shafts of diffused light fell through carved grilles. The breeze brought not only relief, but a sense of continuity. Reminders that the house was part of something larger, connected to earth and sky through currents no human hand could command. In the interplay of moving air and still architecture, a kind of quiet poetry unfolded. Wealthier patrons commissioned towers with intricate plasterwork and glazed tiles. Motifs of cypress trees, calligraphic verses, and geometric stars adorned the inner walls. These embellishments were more than decoration. They expressed gratitude for the elements, for the air that tempered the heat, for the builders who shaped it into something useful, for the long chain of knowledge that made such comfort possible. To live beneath a wind tower was to live surrounded by reminders of interdependence, of the way environment, craft, and community are bound together. Occasionally, a tower was designed as a deliberate statement of status. In Old Shiraz, a few notable merchants built houses with multiple towers rising from different wings. Neighbors took note of which direction each vent faced and how elaborately it was finished. The number of towers became a shorthand for prestige, like owning a fine horse or a generous garden. But even the humblest homes could boast a single, well-made tower, a democratic testament to skill over wealth. The aesthetics extended beyond architecture to the way the towers sounded. When wind moved through their shafts, it produced a low, melodic sigh that was as familiar to residents as birdsong. Some likened the resonance to a distant flute. Children learned to recognize the changing notes, a sharp rush on gusty afternoons, a hushed murmur at night. These tonal shifts became part of the rhythm of domestic life, a background music shaped by the contours of clay and air. What is remarkable is how little distinction people made between the tower's beauty and its function. To them, the two were inseparable. An elegant form was part of what made the tower effective. Graceful openings caught wind more efficiently. Careful proportions ensured steady airflow. In this fusion of art and engineering, the builders affirmed a core principle, that what pleases the eye can also serve the body. Modern observers sometimes marvel that such refinement arose in places so arid and inhospitable. But to the Persians who built and used these towers, it was obvious. In the face of hardship, beauty was not a luxury, but a necessity. It was proof that human beings could shape their world in ways that nurtured the spirit as well as the flesh. Today, visitors who wander the old quarters of Yazd or Kashan still feel this blend of utility and grace. The towers rise silently over narrow lanes, their openings dark against the sky. Even when long disused, they maintain their dignified presence, a reminder that in another era, architecture did more than shelter. It was inspiring. In the next chapter, we will explore how these towers came to symbolize cultural identity, connecting generations and regions through their distinctive forms. Chapter 12. The Wind Tower as Cultural Symbol. Over centuries, as towns grew and dynasties rose and fell, the Wind Tower transformed from a clever solution into a powerful emblem of Persian life. It was more than an architectural feature. It was a declaration that even in the harshest environments, people could thrive through ingenuity and respect for nature. The Wind Tower stood at the crossroads of practicality and meaning, its silhouette etched into collective memory, its presence woven into every story the desert told. In many communities, the tower was first encountered in childhood. Children played beneath its steady currents, learning to recognize which direction the breeze came from, how it shifted with the seasons, how it cooled the air after dusk. Elders explained that the tower was their inheritance, a legacy that connected them to grandparents and great-grandparents who had once sat in the same cooled rooms, grateful for the relief it offered. The tower was a teacher, reminding each generation that survival was a matter not only of endurance, but of observation and adaptation. Writers and poets, too, found inspiration in its form. In medieval verses, the tower sometimes appeared as a metaphor for vigilance. A watchful eye turned to the sky. In other works, it stood for grace under pressure, or for the quiet power of patience. The Sufi mystics of Iran occasionally likened the tower's airflow to the breath of divine presence, unseen but essential, sustaining life through the simple act of moving through the world. Merchants returning from long caravans spoke with pride of their wind-cooled homes, describing how travelers from distant cities would marvel at their comfort. Over time, these stories spread the tower's reputation far beyond the Persian plateau. In the bazaars of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo, traders swapped accounts of buildings cooled without fan or fountain, of towers that seemed almost magical to outsiders. As Persia encountered new powers, the Seljuks, the Mongols, the Safavids, the Wind Tower remained an anchor of continuity. It outlasted shifts in religion and language, survived wars and droughts. When modern visitors passed through ancient quarters, they often remarked that the towers looked timeless, as though they had risen from the same earth that baked beneath them. This sense of permanence contributed to their symbolic weight. In a region often marked by upheaval, the Wind Tower became a sign of resilience. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, as photography spread, the towers appeared in some of the earliest images captured of Iranian cities. To European eyes, they seemed exotic, strange projections over flat roofs. But for locals, these images documented something precious and ordinary, something that made life in the desert not merely tolerable, but dignified. The towers also shaped the language people used to describe home. In Yazd, a common blessing for a newborn child was that their life might be as cool as the breeze in the wind catcher. Families spoke of the comfort of a tower-cooled room as the mark of a good household. When a marriage was arranged or a house purchased, the presence of a functioning wind tower could tip the balance, seen as proof that the builder respected tradition and cared for the well-being of all who would live there. In more recent decades, amid the pressures of modernization, the wind tower took on another role, that of cultural heritage. As modern air conditioners began to replace passive cooling, many towers were abandoned or neglected, but others were carefully restored, their plaster repaired, their vents reopened. Municipal governments in cities like Yazd and Kashan recognized that preserving these structures was not simply about nostalgia. It was about honoring a relationship to place that spanned centuries. Architectural historians and preservationists began documenting every detail: the thickness of the walls, the angle of the vents, the decorative flourishes that varied from town to town. They recorded oral histories from the last generation of craftsmen who still remembered how to build a tower by hand. Each interview, each measurement, became part of a broader effort to protect a culture's memory from being erased by progress. Meanwhile, contemporary architects looking for sustainable solutions started re-examining the towers through a different lens. They saw not just relics, but blueprints for the future. In their elegant geometry lay answers to the pressing questions of a warming world. How to cool buildings without fossil fuels, how to create comfort without noise and machinery, how to design spaces that honored both human needs and environmental limits. In this way, the wind tower evolved from a necessity to a symbol of hope. It showed that ancient knowledge, far from being obsolete, could illuminate the path forward. It demonstrated that cultures anchored in respect for nature had much to teach those now grappling with the consequences of resource-hungry technologies. For people who grew up in the shadow of a tower, the sight of one still standing brought an unmistakable reassurance. Whether in a restored historic quarter or a dusty neighborhood waiting for preservation, the tower reminded them that their ancestors had learned to live with the land rather than against it, and that this wisdom had been handed down generation by generation. In the next chapter, we will explore the gradual decline of wind towers in the 20th century and how shifting ideas about progress and modernity nearly consigned them to oblivion. Chapter 13, Decline in the Age of Progress. The story of the wind tower is not only a tale of triumph and endurance, it is also one of gradual neglect. In the early decades of the 20th century, as ideas of progress swept across the Middle East, the graceful towers that once defined Persian skylines began to be regarded as relics of an older, less advanced world. New technologies promised a different future, and the very qualities that had made wind towers beloved came to be seen as quaint or inconvenient. Electricity was the first agent of change. With the arrival of electrical grids, homes that had relied on passive cooling systems gained access to fans and, eventually, mechanical air conditioning. At first, these devices were novelties, a sign that a household had embraced modernity. They could be switched on and off at will, delivering cold air regardless of wind direction or season. In rapidly growing cities, this controllability held enormous appeal. Yet as families installed fans and later air conditioners, the wind towers lost their central role. Many were partially blocked to prevent dust and insects, or sealed off entirely to keep cooled air from escaping. Some homeowners dismantled them to reclaim roof space or because they believed the towers made their houses look old-fashioned. In larger cities, where new apartment blocks rose in place of courtyard houses, developers rarely included a wind tower at all. The skyline thinned, shedding its forest of vents and turrets. At the same time, ideas about hygiene and cleanliness shifted. The open shafts of wind towers, once prized for their fresh breezes, were sometimes criticized as conduits for germs or pollution. Dust storms, more frequent in the 20th century as land use changed, could sweep grit into rooms. Rather than adapting or maintaining their towers, many owners saw sealing them as simpler. Education, too, played a role in the decline. As schools adopted curricula based on Western models of science and engineering, young architects often learned little about the indigenous knowledge of their own regions. The centuries-old art of designing wind towers was rarely taught in formal training. Even where it was discussed, it tended to be described in historical rather than practical terms, a curiosity rather than a living tradition. Economic shifts also contributed. With oil revenues rising and cities expanding, governments prioritized infrastructure projects and modern housing over preservation. New materials, like reinforced concrete and steel, became symbols of progress. Urban planning strategies encouraged higher density buildings that left little room for internal courtyards and a natural ventilation strategies that worked best with wind towers. The humble mud brick lost its place to cement, and with it, the intuitive thermal balance that had supported passive cooling. By the middle of the 20th century, observers noted that many towers had fallen into disrepair. Cracks spread through plastered walls. Wooden lattices decayed or disappeared. In some towns, once gleaming facades had faded to a patchwork of crumbling surfaces and broken vents. For the first time in centuries, the towers became invisible in daily life, so common as to be unremarkable, yet so obsolete that few considered their preservation urgent. But even amid this decline, a few voices argued that something precious was being lost. In the 1960s and 1970s, scholars and architects began to re-examine the principles underlying the wind tower. They measured airflow and temperature differentials, confirming what generations of builders had known intuitively, that the towers could keep homes 10 or even 15 degrees cooler than the outside air. Studies showed how little energy was required to achieve this effect compared to electric cooling. As environmental concerns grew worldwide, the relevance of these findings slowly gained recognition. Yet by then, many towers were already beyond repair. The skills needed to restore them had become rare. The artisans who once specialized in their construction retired or passed on. Rebuilding was possible, but costly and difficult. In some neighborhoods, families simply adjusted to life without them. Children who had grown up with the gentle rush of air in their bedrooms came to accept the drone of electric compressors. Rooflines changed, flattening as towers vanished. Visitors noted that cities felt hotter, less shaded, less alive to the wind's subtle variations. This decline reflected a broader paradox of modernity, that in gaining new technologies, societies sometimes forgot what older knowledge could offer. For a time, the wind tower became a symbol not of pride, but of poverty, a marker that a home lacked the means to modernize. It took decades for this perception to soften. Yet the story did not end in loss alone. In the next chapter, we will see how, as global awareness of climate change and sustainability grew, the wind tower began to return to architectural conversations, not as an anachronism, but as a guide for building a different kind of future. Chapter 14. Rediscovery and Renewal. By the final decades of the 20th century, a quiet shift had begun to gather momentum. Around the world, architects and planners were awakening to the costs of relying on energy-intensive systems to create comfort. In cities where air conditioning had once symbolized sophistication, the downsides became undeniable. Soaring electricity demands, noisy machinery, sealed windows that severed people from the rhythms of daylight and fresh air. In Iran, this realization rekindled curiosity about the wind tower. What had been dismissed as backward was reconsidered through a different lens, one shaped by the urgency of climate change and the desire to preserve cultural heritage. In Yazd, Kashin, and Kerman, communities began documenting the remaining towers. Old drawings, family records, and construction manuals were collected and studied. Conservation groups appeared, determined to save what was left before further neglect rendered the towers irreparable. Scholars interviewed masons who still remembered the correct proportions of shafts, the precise recipes for mud plaster, the angles at which vents should be cut to catch the summer winds. These recollections, once regarded as folklore, now had the status of technical knowledge, vital to repairing structures that no modern blueprint fully captured. At the same time, international organizations like UNESCO recognized that wind towers were not merely local curiosities. They were examples of humanity's collective ingenuity, evidence that long before industrialization, builders had discovered how to harmonize architecture with the environment. This acknowledgement gave fresh legitimacy to preservation efforts. Funding increased. Training programs revived long-dormant skills. Yet rediscovery was not confined to restoration alone. Some architects began to envision new buildings inspired by the wind tower's principles. They asked a deceptively simple question: Could ancient design help modern cities reduce their energy use without sacrificing comfort? Pilot projects offered promising answers. In university laboratories, scale models of towers were tested in wind tunnels. Sensors measured temperature gradients and airflow speeds, confirming that traditional configurations could cool interior spaces by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. These results were not theoretical curiosities. They demonstrated solutions relevant to cities facing extreme heat and unreliable power. Soon, contemporary homes and public buildings in Iran and the Gulf began to incorporate reimagined towers. Some borrowed their classic forms, tall shafts rising above flat roofs, vents angled to harness prevailing breezes. Others adapted the concept, using modern materials or hybrid systems that blended passive cooling with low-energy fans. One striking example was a school complex in Yazd, built in the early 2000s. The architects designed a series of wind towers over classrooms and gathering spaces. During summer, the towers channeled air through underground channels cooled by residual moisture. The result was a learning environment comfortable without mechanical air conditioning, an approach that inspired similar projects in the region. Beyond practical applications, the towers also reclaimed their place in cultural identity. Residents who had once viewed them as outdated came to see them as symbols of local wisdom and continuity. In festivals and heritage events, restored towers were lit at night, their outlines glowing against desert skies. Children toured the interiors, learning how their ancestors had read the wind and built to endure it. This rediscovery also sparked conversations about what progress truly meant. Had modernity been too quick to discard what was old? Could heritage and innovation coexist? In these debates, the wind tower stood as both example and metaphor, a reminder that solutions to contemporary problems sometimes lay hidden in the past, waiting to be recognized anew. Internationally, architects and environmental designers began to cite Persian wind towers as case studies in passive cooling. University courses examined their physics alongside contemporary green building strategies. Documentaries showcased their silent elegance. What had been nearly forgotten returned as a point of pride and a valuable contribution to global knowledge. Even so, challenges remained. Many historic towers still needed urgent repair. Skilled craftspeople were few. Funding was often precarious. Yet momentum continued to build, supported by a growing conviction that preserving these structures was not only an act of nostalgia, but an investment in the future. In this renaissance, the wind tower revealed its most enduring lesson, that true sustainability comes not from constant reinvention, but from understanding and respecting what has already proven its worth. In the final chapter, we will reflect on what these ancient structures can teach us today about resilience, beauty, and the art of living in balance with nature. Chapter 15, Lessons for a Warming World. As the 21st century advanced, the wind tower, once nearly forgotten, found its place again in the shared imagination. Architects, historians, and everyday citizens began to look up at those quiet structures with renewed respect. In the rising heat of modern cities, the simple, graceful towers seem to offer not only a glimpse of the past, but a promise for the future. That humanity had always been capable of meeting its challenges with creativity and care. Today, in the lanes of Yazd, you can still see them, some newly restored, others bearing the patina of centuries. They stand over adobe courtyards and tiled roofs, their vents open to the ever-shifting desert winds. When visitors ask why they endure, the answers are as varied as the people who live among them. Some speak of tradition, others of necessity, and still others of the quiet sense of continuity that comes from inhabiting spaces shaped by generations of thoughtful hands. The lessons of the wind tower are, at their heart, simple. First, that building in harmony with climate is not a novel idea, but an old, proven path. Second, that beauty and function can be one and the same, neither sacrifice for the other. Third, that even in an age of rapid change, ancient wisdom need not be discarded, only understood and adapted. In recent years, as heat waves have become more frequent and cities around the world have struggled with energy demands, Persian wind towers have been studied with fresh urgency. Designers in Europe and Asia have experimented with similar passive cooling concepts: tall chimneys, shaded atriums, porous screens. Each variation testifies to the universality of the problem and the relevance of solutions long overlooked. Yet even as engineers analyze temperature curves and airflow patterns, there remains something intangible about the tower's legacy. They are more than devices. They are symbols of an approach to life, one that values patience over speed, continuity over novelty, humility over conquest. In the hush of a wind-cooled room, it is possible to feel connected to something larger than oneself, a cycle of seasons, a lineage of builders, an enduring respect for place. Stories still circulate among the old neighborhoods. A grandmother recalls the summer evenings when she and her sisters sat beneath the tower's vent, shelling pistachios and feeling the breeze across their necks. A mason recounts how his father taught him to shape the plaster so that air would flow evenly, never too fast, never too still. A young architect describes the first time he felt the cool rush inside a restored tower, how it seemed almost miraculous that clay and wind alone could be enough. These memories are as vital to the tower's survival as any technical plan. For when knowledge is passed as story, it takes root in the heart as well as the mind. It becomes part of a community's identity, something worth protecting not only for its utility, but for the way it holds together the past and the present. In a warming world, where the challenges of comfort and sustainability grow more urgent with each passing year, the Persian wind tower reminds us that innovation does not always mean abandoning old paths. Sometimes it means returning to them with new eyes and deeper understanding. So when you see the outline of a wind tower rising above a desert town, remember that you are looking at more than architecture. You are witnessing the embodiment of patience and skill, the legacy of people who learned to read the air and shape it into a gift. It is a testament to the idea that wisdom endures, not just in books and blueprints, but in the living spaces where generations have found relief, shelter, and beauty. May we, too, learn to honor the past as we build our future, and to trust that the simplest ideas, born of necessity and care, may prove the most lasting of all. Thank you for spending this time exploring the story of the Persian wind towers. These graceful structures remind us that human ingenuity can flourish in the most demanding environments, and that ancient wisdom still has the power to inspire modern solutions. May we carry forward their lessons of respect for nature, thoughtful design, and the quiet beauty of living in balance.